The smell of hospitals has a particular cruelty to it. Not the antiseptic sharpness people always describe. It's subtler than that. It's the smell of waiting. Of fluorescent light that never changes whether it's noon or 3 in the morning. Of paper cups and low voices and the particular stillness of people who have nothing left to do but sit. My name is Clara. I'm 38 years old, and I was sitting in a plastic chair outside my father's room at Harwick General when everything I had ever understood about my own life stopped being true. I'd driven 4 hours from Columbus after my mother called. Her voice on the phone had that careful flatness she used when she didn't want to show how frightened she was. Clipped, precise, almost administrative. Your father had a cardiac episode. They've stabilized him. You should come. Not please come, not I need you, just you should come, as if she were noting an item on a list. Raymond Aldrich was 71 years old and had never once, in all the years I could remember, admitted to being tired. He chopped his own firewood until he was 68. He drove himself to every appointment. He fixed the gutters on the house the autumn before last, standing on a ladder while my mother watched from the kitchen window with her arms folded, not offering to help, not asking him to stop. That was their language, a conversation conducted entirely in what was not said. I arrived at the hospital just after 11 at night. My mother was in the waiting room, sitting very straight in a chair near the window, her coat still on, her handbag balanced on her knees. She looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I just hadn't looked at her carefully in a long time. She stood when she saw me, accepted the hug I offered, and then stepped back quickly, as though too much contact was its own kind of vulnerability. "He's been asking for you," she said. That was all. A nurse led me down the corridor to his room. The door was half open. My father lay against the inclined bed with monitoring leads across his chest and an oxygen clip on his finger, looking diminished in the way people who are normally large look diminished when they are reduced to lying still. But his eyes were open, and when I came through the door, something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than relief. I pulled the chair close to his bed and took his hand. His skin felt papery, loose over the knuckles in a way I hadn't noticed before. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking, his thumb moving slightly against my palm. Then he said a name. Not my mother's. Not the name of anyone I knew. "Vera," he said. Quietly. With a tenderness in his voice I had never once heard him use for my mother. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I sat very still and watched his eyes, and something in my chest, something I couldn't name yet, something I hadn't been given vocabulary for, began to loosen from its moorings. "Dad," I said carefully. "It's Clara." He blinked. His hand tightened around mine, and his expression shifted into something I could only read as guilt. Not confusion. Not the vagueness of medication or exhaustion. Guilt. Clear, conscious, specific guilt. "I know," he said. "I know who you are." He closed his eyes. The monitor beside him continued its steady rhythm. I sat there holding his hand and felt the particular silence of a question that has just been asked without anyone intending to ask it. Outside the room, down the corridor, my mother sat with her coat on and her handbag balanced on her knees, waiting. I stayed in Harwick for 4 days. My parents' house was the same house I'd grown up in. A 2-story colonial on Sutter Lane with a covered porch and a vegetable garden my mother maintained with the same focused efficiency she applied to everything. The kitchen smelled of coffee and the particular brand of dish soap she'd used my entire life. And the second-floor hallway still had the same runner carpet, slightly worn down the center, that had been there since I was 9 years old. Being in that house as an adult had always produced in me a curious doubling. I was simultaneously the woman I had become and the child who had navigated these rooms with the careful attentiveness of someone learning a language whose rules were never directly stated. My parents' marriage was not cold exactly. It was correct. Functional. They did not fight. They ate dinner together every evening at 6:30. They attended church on Sundays, neighborhood gatherings when expected, family functions when required. They moved through the architecture of a shared life with the precision of people who had agreed, somewhere along the way, to prioritize the structure over the interior. I had always assumed this was simply what long marriages became. I had told myself this, actually reminded myself of it during stretches of my own life when connection felt thin and difficult. This is what it looks like after 40 years. This is what it settles into. I had used my parents' marriage as a kind of proof that quiet endurance was its own form of love. Looking back now, I think I was doing something different. I was using their distance as permission not to ask questions. The flatness between them was convenient for all of us. My father came home on the third day. He moved slowly and accepted help with a wordless stoicism that told me the difficulty of needing assistance bothered him more than any physical discomfort. He sat in his armchair in the living room with a blanket across his lap and the television on at low volume, and did not bring up what he had said in the hospital. Neither did I. My mother moved around the house with her usual efficiency, preparing his medication schedule, answering the calls from his doctor's office, communicating everything through action rather than language. She did not ask how the drive up had been. She did not ask about my job or my apartment or the man I had briefly been seeing before things quietly dissolved 3 months earlier. She offered food, coffee, the practical infrastructure of hospitality. This was how she showed care. I had always known this. I had spent 38 years translating it. On the second evening, while my father was resting, I sat at the kitchen table across from my mother and asked if she wanted help going through his medications. She said she had it handled. We sat in silence for a moment with our coffee cups in front of us. "He seems tired," I said. "He had a cardiac episode," she said. "I mean in general. Before this." She looked at me over the rim of her cup with an expression I recognized, a particular form of attention that was also a form of deflection, in which she appeared to be listening while deciding how little she needed to respond. "He's 71, she said. "He's entitled to be tired." I remember feeling in that moment a small specific frustration that I immediately folded away. This was the choreography we'd always performed. I reached towards something real, she redirected towards something manageable. I had always accepted this as the natural limit of our conversations. It hadn't occurred to me that the limit was deliberate. I told myself I would not think about the name. I told myself it meant nothing: medication, disorientation. The floating confusion of a frightened man reaching for something familiar. There were explanations. There were always explanations if you were willing to accept them. I was apparently very willing. On my last morning, I walked through the house while my parents were both still upstairs and found myself standing in the doorway of my father's study. I had never been forbidden from this room. It simply wasn't a room I'd ever had reason to enter. It was his desk, his bookshelves, his framed photographs from the engineering firm where he'd spent 30 years. I stood in the doorway and looked at the photographs on the shelf above his desk. My parents on their wedding day. My mother's parents at Christmas, years dead. A photograph of me at roughly 7 years old, sitting in the backyard in the summer, squinting against the sun. And beside it, partially obscured by a brass desk lamp, a photograph I didn't recognize. A woman I had never seen. Younger than my mother in the picture, perhaps mid-30s. Dark hair. Standing in front of water, a lake I thought, or a reservoir. Smiling directly at the camera with an openness that felt startlingly candid, especially against the formal correctness of every other image in that room. Picked it up. Turned it over. On the back, in my father's handwriting, V. August 1987. I was born in November 1986. I set the photograph back exactly where I had found it, adjusted the position of the lamp, and walked out of the study. I told my parents I needed to get back for work. I hugged my father carefully, feeling the new fragility of his frame. I hugged my mother, who patted my shoulder twice and told me to drive safely. I drove south on the interstate for 40 minutes before I had to pull over into a rest stop parking lot and sit with my hands on the steering wheel, looking at nothing, breathing carefully. I didn't cry. I wasn't even sure yet what there was to cry about. But something had changed in the architecture of everything, and I could feel the shift before I could name its shape. I did not call my parents that first week back. This was not unusual. Our conversations were scheduled rather than spontaneous Sunday evenings, the kind of calls that ran about 12 minutes and covered health, weather, and logistics before reaching a natural end. But I was aware that first week of a new quality to the silence. A weight in it that hadn't been there before. I went through my days at school, 5 sections of high school art, sophomore portfolios, a junior's project on architectural sketching, and carried the photograph in my mind with the steadiness of something that refused to dissolve. V. August 1987. I was born in November 1986, conceived by simple arithmetic in early winter of that year. I told myself I was constructing a story from insufficient material. A photograph from 1987 told me nothing definitively. My father was a human being with a life that preceded me, with friendships and histories I had no window into. The name Vera in a hospital room could have been anyone, a colleague, an old neighbor, someone half present in a medicated dream. I told myself this with enough conviction that I almost believed it. What I couldn't argue away was the look on his face. Not confusion, guilt. I called my Aunt Peg on a Wednesday evening. My father's younger sister, 65 years old, retired from teaching, living now in Dayton in a small house full of plants and books and the organized clutter of a woman who had spent decades caring more about comfort than appearance. Peg was the only member of my father's family I had any genuine ease with. She was direct without being blunt, warm without being performative, and she asked real questions rather than safe ones. "How's Ray doing?" she asked when she picked up. Not your father, always Ray, always first name, the informality of a sibling relationship that had survived decades. "Improving," I said. "He was home when I left. Mom has the medication sorted. Diane always has everything sorted," Peg said, with a neutrality that could have meant anything. I hesitated. Then, "Peg, do you know someone named Vera? Someone who knew Dad?" The pause that followed was brief, perhaps 2 seconds, perhaps 3. The kind of pause that doesn't announce itself as significant but registers in the body before the mind processes it. "Why do you ask?" she said. "Not no. Not I don't think so or the name doesn't ring a bell. Just why do you ask?" "He said her name in the hospital," I said, "before he knew I was there." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Clara," she said, and her voice had changed. Careful now, measured, carrying the weight of someone choosing words from a larger set than the one they were sharing. "Some things belong to your father to tell. Peg. I mean that with love." "I know you do. Peg, please." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I don't think this is my conversation to have with you. But I will tell you this, if you want to understand something you might try looking at what your parents don't talk about. You've always been observant. You noticed more than they thought you did." She changed the subject. We talked for another 20 minutes about her garden and my school year. And I let her guide us there because I understood that she had given me what she was willing to give. What your parents don't talk about. I thought about the study, the photograph beside the lamp, the way my mother had deflected every approach to anything real for 38 years. The specific architecture of avoidance they had both maintained with such precision that I had mistaken it for simply the way families were. And then I thought about my best friend Sasha. Sasha Moreland, 39, whom I had known since we were 7 years old, whose family had lived 2 streets over on Sutter Lane, who had grown up in my parents' kitchen almost as often as in her own, who had spent summers and holidays and the particular teenage sprawl of long afternoons in that house, who knew my parents in the way childhood friends' families know each other, not through formal presentation but through accretion, through years of ordinary proximity. Sasha, who had moved back to Harwick 3 years ago to care for her own mother, who still had Sunday dinners at my parents' house every few months, something I'd always found touching, the way she'd maintained that connection even when I had grown apart from the texture of daily life in that town. I called her Thursday evening. She answered on the second ring, warm and easy. "Clara, how's Ray? I heard from your mom he's home." "He's okay," I said. "Hey, can I ask you something strange?" "Always." "Did you ever hear the name Vera mentioned? Growing up? In my parents' house or any context involving my dad?" The silence this time was different from Peg's. Peg's silence had been the silence of someone deciding how much to say. Sasha's silence was the silence of someone who had not expected the question, and was now doing something much more complicated. "Where is this coming from?" she said finally. And in that moment, in the specific shape of that deflection, which was not Peg's careful love but something else entirely, something inside me understood that Sasha already knew. Had known perhaps for a very long time. Had eaten Sunday dinners at my parents' table, and asked me about my life in Columbus and never once said a word. "He said her name in the hospital," I said evenly. "I found a photograph. Clara. Sasha. Do you know who she is?" A very long pause. I think you should talk to your parents, she said softly. I said goodnight and put the phone down. I sat in my apartment in the particular silence of a woman who has just had a 30-year friendship reorganized inside her chest. I hadn't been building toward this moment. There was no preparation for it. It arrived like weather, sudden and comprehensive, changing the atmosphere of everything at once. I drove back to Harwick on a Saturday unannounced. I had spent 2 weeks thinking and had arrived at the understanding that thinking was no longer sufficient. I needed to know with the specificity that only direct confrontation could provide, and I needed to arrive before my own resolve had time to negotiate itself into silence. My mother answered the door with an expression that moved through surprise into a careful composure in approximately 3 seconds. Clara, you should have called. I know, I said. Can I come in? My father was in the living room. He looked better than when I'd left. Some color returned, moving without the careful tentativeness of the first days home. He stood when I came in, and the guilt that crossed his face told me everything about what he had been waiting for. Sit down, Dad, I said. I need to ask you something. My mother came in from the hallway and stood near the doorway with her arms crossed. Her expression controlled in the way a person controls something they are afraid might otherwise move without permission. I looked at my father. Who is Vera? The room changed. Not dramatically. No one moved, no voices rose. But the quality of the silence altered completely, and I watched my father's face go through something I had never seen on it before. The collapse of a structure that had been held in place by sustained effort for a very long time. Clara, my mother said. I'm asking Dad, I said. My father looked at his hands in his lap. Then he looked at me, and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with his heart. She was someone I loved, he said. Before your mother. And during. The word during landed quietly and did enormous damage. How long? I asked. Years, he said. Several years. Did it end? He was quiet for a moment. She moved away. We lost contact. When? 1988. I felt the number register in my body before I processed it consciously. 1988. 14 months after the photograph on his shelf. 14 months after August 1987. 14 months after I was born. Dad, I said. My voice was very even. I was proud of it abstractly. Am I your biological daughter? My mother made a sound that was not quite speech. My father looked at me steadily. Yes, he said. Yes, Clara. You are. Something in me loosened. Relief, perhaps, or the release of a particular fear I hadn't let myself fully form. But the relief was partial because there was still the photograph, still the years, still the timeline I had constructed that didn't quite settle. Then who is she? I said. Why was her photograph on your desk? Why did you say her name when you thought you were alone? He was quiet for a very long time. Raymond, my mother said from the doorway. Her voice had changed lower with an edge I didn't recognize. Not anger. Something more structural than anger. The tone of a woman enforcing an agreement that was about to be broken. She deserves to know, my father said. Ray. She deserves to know, Diane. My mother unfolded her arms and walked out of the room. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, slow and precise, and then the sound of a door closing quietly above us. My father looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then, Vera wasn't just someone I knew. She was someone she mattered to me in a way I didn't have language for at 33 years old. We ended because she left. Not because I chose to end it. Did Mom know? Yes. For how long? From the beginning, he said. We had an arrangement. A decision we made together about the marriage and about what it would contain. It wasn't a secret from each other. It was a choice. I sat with that for a moment. An open marriage, I said. He didn't flinch from the term. Something like that. Early on. Before it became something we didn't discuss anymore. And Vera left. She moved to Seattle in '88. We wrote for a few years. Then we didn't. That photograph on your desk. He looked somewhere slightly past me. I kept it because some things you keep. I didn't think anyone looked at those shelves. I thought of Peg on the phone. If you want to understand something, look at what your parents don't talk about. She had known the shape of it for decades and had decided it wasn't hers to say. And Sasha. Sasha knows, I said. It wasn't a question. My father's expression shifted. What? She knows something. Or knew. I could tell when I called her. He shook his head slowly. I don't know how she would. He paused. Your mother and Sasha are close. They always have been. And there it was, the second structural collapse of the day. Sasha hadn't discovered something she wasn't supposed to know. Sasha had been told. At some point, for some reason, my mother had told her. And Sasha had decided, consciously, repeatedly, that her place at my parents' Sunday table was worth more than 30 years of honesty with me. I stayed for another hour. My mother did not come back downstairs. My father and I talked with a halting rawness that was exhausting and necessary, moving around the edges of things that had no clean resolution, not because he was withholding but because some human experiences resist the architecture of explanation. He had loved someone. He had made choices. He had spent decades maintaining a marriage that was something other than what it appeared to be from the outside. And he had kept a photograph on a shelf because some things you keep, and he had set a name in a hospital room when he thought he might be running out of time. Driving back to Columbus that evening, I thought about something that surfaced slowly as I moved through the darkening flat country of central Ohio. I had spent 38 years reading my parents' distance as a form of love, the settled, weathered endurance of people who had chosen to stay. I had been wrong about the texture of it. The distance had not been the residue of long marriage. It had been the maintenance of something much more complicated and much more human. Two people who had built a life around a negotiated reality, and had paid for it in the currency of silence. What struck me finally wasn't anger. It was a kind of sorrowful recognition. They had made their choices. Some of them were not choices I would have made. Some of them had shaped me without my consent, had given me a template for distance I'd been unknowingly applying to my own life, my own relationships, my own quiet acceptance of things that deserved to be asked about. That understanding didn't make the drive easier, but it made it real. I called Sasha the following week. Not to confront her, or not only that. I'd spent several days past the first shock moving through a quieter and more complicated feeling, something that lived underneath the betrayal and was, in some ways, harder to process, grief. For the particular friendship I thought I had. For the version of Sasha I'd believed in since we were 7 years old, sitting in my parents' kitchen eating cereal after school, talking about everything and nothing with the ease of people who assumed total honesty was the foundation they were standing on. She answered quickly and said my name with the careful warmth of someone who had been waiting and dreading. I know you talked to your dad, she said. Yes. Clara, Let me go first, I said. I wasn't angry. My voice was level and I meant it to stay that way because anger would have made this a fight, and a fight would have made it easier for both of us to avoid the real shape of the thing. How long have you known? A pause. Your mother told me about 7 years ago. We were talking, it came out. She didn't plan to say it. And you decided not to tell me. I didn't think it was. Sasha. I know, she said. Very quietly. I know. 7 years of Sunday dinners with my parents. 7 years of calling me and asking about my life in Columbus. 7 years of knowing something about the family I grew up in that I didn't know. How did that feel? Every time you talked to me. A long silence. Not good, she said. I believe you. I told myself it wasn't mine to share. I told myself it was their story, not mine to. It was my story, I said. It was about my family. My parents. My life. Whatever logic you used to stay quiet, Sasha, it wasn't kindness. It was a choice to protect your access to them over being honest with me. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line. I wasn't saying anything she hadn't already said to herself, I thought. That made it worse in a way. She had made the calculation clearly, not in ignorance. I don't know what to say to you, she said finally. I'm sorry feels inadequate. It does, I said. But you can say it anyway. I'm sorry, Clara. I am genuinely sorry. I sat with that for a moment. There was something real in it. I could hear the realness. Sasha was not a bad person. She was a person who had made a choice in one direction and had lived with it long enough that reversing it had felt impossible. I understood that mechanism. I understood, actually, how people talk themselves into staying inside incomplete truths. I'd watched my parents do it for decades and I'd been doing my own version of it without knowing it. That didn't redeem the choice. But it located it within something recognizable. I need some time, I said. I don't know what this looks like going forward. I understand. I'm not ending this. But I need some distance. And I need you to know, if you ever know something that involves me again, I need you to tell me. Whatever the cost. Okay, she said. Okay, yes. I drove up to Harwick one final time 2 weeks later. And this time I called ahead. My mother opened the door herself. She had an expression I had never quite seen on her face before. Not composed, not deflecting, but something open and exhausted, and underneath that, slightly frightened. She had been waiting for this in the same way my father had, as something inevitable, long deferred. We sat at the kitchen table. My father stayed in the living room. This conversation was between my mother and me, and we both knew it. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked. Because it wasn't. She stopped. Started again. Because you didn't need to know. That was your decision to make? She looked down at her coffee cup. Yes. I thought so, yes. What were you afraid of? She was quiet for a long time. When she answered, her voice was different, stripped of the administrative precision, slower, closer to something real. I was afraid you would understand him better than you understand me. I was afraid that knowing would make you choose. And that you wouldn't choose me. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I looked at my mother, 68 years old, still straight-backed, hands folded around her coffee cup, and I saw with a clarity I hadn't had before, the specific fear she had been managing for 38 years. Not jealousy of a woman long gone. Fear of her own daughter. Fear that love was a competition in which she might lose. I wouldn't have chosen Mom, I said. I would have just known you. Both of you. The real version. She nodded. Very slightly. Her jaw moved. I know that now, she said. We didn't resolve everything that afternoon. Some things in families don't resolve, they shift, become more honest, make room for new configurations that are less tidy but more real. We talked for 2 hours, and my mother said more true things in those 2 hours than in the accumulated weight of most of my adult life. It wasn't easy for either of us. Easy had never been her language. But real turned out to be available. It had been there all along, waiting behind the machinery of silence. It just needed someone to stop accepting the silence as the final answer. 6 months later, I drove back to Harwick for Thanksgiving. It was the same house. Same covered porch, same kitchen smell, same runner carpet worn down the center of the upstairs hall. My father was stronger now, not what he had been, but present in the room in a new way, less armored. My mother had made the same dishes she made every year, the same sequence of rituals that structured the holiday into a recognizable shape. But something was different. Not dramatically. No grand transformation, no family meeting, no cathartic scene of reconciliation. Just a shift in what was permitted to be said. My father mentioned Vera's name once, briefly, in the context of explaining an old photograph Peg had brought, and my mother didn't leave the room. She looked at the photograph and said quietly, she was very striking. And that was that. 3 words that represented, I understood, an enormous distance traveled. Peg sat across from me at dinner and caught my eye once with a look that said everything about what she had known and carried, and was glad to set down. I didn't feel angry at her anymore. She had told me what she could, in the way she could. Sometimes love looks like handing someone a direction rather than a map. Sasha and I had spoken twice in those 6 months. Carefully, at first, both of us navigating a friendship that had to be rebuilt on different foundations than the ones it started on. I didn't know yet what it would become. I knew that the version of it that relied on her omission was finished, and that whatever came next would be more honest, and that honest was always harder and always worth more. I had done something else in those 6 months. Something I hadn't expected. I had started asking questions in my own life, the ones I had been trained by decades of family example not to ask. In conversations that had previously reached the comfortable limit, I kept going. In my own patterns of silence, my own inherited tendency to accept incomplete truths as sufficient, I had started to push back. Not with force. With simple refusal to stop at the boundary. What I found consistently was that the real version was better. Harder sometimes. More exposed. But better. It was the strangest gift my father's hospital room had given me. He had said a name when he thought he might be dying, and in that name was the whole architecture of everything my family had built and concealed and paid for. I had followed the thread not because I wanted to destroy anything but because I could not pretend I hadn't seen it. And the following had led me somewhere my parents had never quite been able to go. The territory on the other side of the silence, where things were smaller and more real and strangely easier to carry. My father and I washed the Thanksgiving dishes together that evening, side by side at the sink, the kitchen quiet around us. He handed me a dish to dry and said without looking at me, "I'm glad you came that day." "Which day?" I asked. "Both days," he said. I thought about that for a moment. "Me too," I said. My mother was in the next room, watching television at low volume, the sound of it drifting through the doorway, small and ordinary and entirely real. I was 38 years old and I had just started to learn what it meant to know my parents. Not the performance of them. Not the structure. The people. It was late. It was enough. What this story ultimately traces is not a single act of betrayal but the architecture of sustained concealment, and the way such architecture, maintained long enough, stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the natural shape of things. Raymond and Diane did not build their marriage on deception in the conventional sense. They built it on a negotiated omission, an agreement made early, to allow the marriage to continue around something that could not be fully accommodated within it. What is striking is not that they made this choice but that they maintained it so flawlessly, for so long that even Clara, living inside its effects her entire life, had never identified the structure beneath the surface. She had absorbed its lessons without knowing she was being taught. The distance she had always read as the natural weathering of long marriage was, in fact, the maintenance cost of silence. These are not the same thing, and the distinction matters enormously. The deeper damage here is not the secret itself. Secrets in marriages are not uncommon. The deeper damage is what the secret required, that everyone around it, Peg, eventually Sasha, and implicitly anyone who spent enough time in that household, had to become to some degree a custodian of it. Sasha's 7 years of silence was not a simple failure of loyalty. It was the natural consequence of having been brought inside the structure. Once you know you are either in or out. Sasha chose the Sunday dinners, chose the warmth of the Aldrich kitchen, chose not to be the person who blew the mechanism apart. She paid for that choice in the private currency of a friendship she was slowly hollowing out from the inside. What Clara does, and this is the emotional core of the story, is refuse to accept the incomplete truth as sufficient. This sounds simple. It is not. Every instinct available to her pointed toward acceptance. Her mother's deflection, her aunt's careful misdirection, her best friend's silence, her father's lifelong habit of non-disclosure, and most importantly, her own inherited tendency to stop at the boundary. She had been trained across 38 years of family life to read the silence as the answer. The act of continuing past it was, in its way, the most radical thing she did. What she finds on the other side is not resolution in any clean narrative sense. Her parents remain themselves. The marriage contains what it always contained. Nothing is repaired in the conventional way. What changes is the terms on which Clara inhabits her own life, the permission she gives herself to keep asking past the comfortable limit, to require the real version rather than the managed one. There is a particular insight the story earns in Diane's confession at the kitchen table. "I was afraid you would choose him over me." It is the moment when the whole 38-year machinery of silence reveals its emotional engine. Not shame about the past. Not protection of a husband's reputation. Fear that her daughter, given the truth, would prefer someone else. This is the heart of the concealment. Not the secret itself, but the mother's terror of being truly known by her own child and found wanting. In that fear, Diane was not protecting her marriage. She was protecting herself. And she had asked everyone around her to help her do it. The story's final image, father and daughter washing dishes, small and quiet, the television audible in the next room, earns its restraint. Nothing has been solved. Everything has been made real. And real, the story suggests, is always the more difficult and more humane destination. What stays with me, thinking about this story, is that question Diane finally answered at the kitchen table. The fear that if Clara knew the truth, she'd choose the other side. And I keep thinking, how many silences in families are built out of exactly that fear? Not cruelty, not selfishness, but the deep, quiet terror of being known completely and still being chosen. We protect people from the truth and tell ourselves it's for them. Sometimes we almost believe it. But underneath, often it's for us, to avoid the exposure, to preserve the image, to keep the shape of the relationship we want rather than allow the shape of the relationship that's real. What Clara did, simply refusing to stop asking, sounds ordinary. It isn't. Walking past the boundary takes something most of us spend decades learning we're allowed to do.